Welcome to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. As I mentioned at the end of the last episode, we do have a second interview this week, and we have a second interview that has some similarities to the interview on Tuesday with Carrie Bove. So the interview on Tuesday was a historical fiction mystery. That one happened to be set in 1920 in New York. This one, we're going back in time a little bit further to 1897, and rather than New York, we are in England and Germany and a couple other, places around Europe. But still historical fiction mystery. It seemed interesting to me that we had coincidences, or that sometimes, my schedule just works out so that I have two books that have some similarities to each other, even though on the surface they don't seem like they are that close. I also, when I was speaking with I'm speaking with author Bradley Harper today. By the way, I did not mention that. Bradley Harper, about his book, it's called Queen's Gambit. It is a Margaret Harkness mystery. It is the second Margaret Harkness mystery. And Bradley and I were talking about the Queen's Jubilee. And if you remember back to Tuesday's episode, Carrie was talking about the Queen's Jubilee, and it was in a different series that she was talking about it, that she had written, but still I was like, wait a minute, we just talked about this. We are talking about it again. So I don't know. I like coincidences. I get kind of geeked out about stuff that I'm like, that is very cool when things just sort of come together like that. At any rate, we are talking about Queen's Gambit, as I said, by Bradley Harper. It is a Margaret Harkness mystery, and the description is as follows. England, 1897. The reign of Queen Victoria, with the majesty of Imperial Britannia in full flower. Super sleuth Margaret Harkness is summoned to London by her old friend, Professor Joseph Bell, the real-life inspiration for Sherlock Holmes. The German government has an anarchist spy in its ranks, and Bell has been commissioned to find the mole and oust him. Thus begins a fatal game of cat and mouse between terrorist and spy-catcher, between revolutionary zeal and scientific deduction. With the mysterious assassin on the move, gunning for none other than Queen Victoria herself, will Margaret and her doughty allies be able to forestall disaster and save the monarch? Set in the richly historical milieu of Victorian Britain, among gas lamps and carriages and spies and ministers, The Queen's Gambit is historical fiction at its most entrancing and deadly. So that is the description of The Queen's Gambit. Or, see, now I'm confused because the back of the book says The Queen's Gambit, but the front of the book says Queen's Gambit. I'm going to go with the front and the spine of the book, which both say Queen's Gambit. Let's look at the title page. I told you I'm a dork. Queen's Gambit. Okay, so the back of the book has the, but it's not the. No definitive article, just so you know. This book is... It reminded me a little bit of the Amelia Peabody series, which I have talked about before, and not similar time periods, I guess. And Margaret's reminded me a little bit of Amelia Peabody. There's really not a lot of similarities. Margaret is a journalist. Amelia is an archaeologist. There's not exactly similarities. I think mostly the similarities are strong feminist women in the Victorian era is kind of the vibe that I was getting. And both women are English, although Amelia spends a lot of her time in Egypt as opposed to England in those books. So what I also found fascinating, and we'll talk more about in the interview, is that Margaret Harkness was an actual historical figure. And so Bradley did a lot of research and found out as much as he could about her, and then made her the main character in these mysteries. And you notice that Joseph Bell is here. He is the inspiration for Sherlock Holmes. Arthur Conan Doyle appears in the first one along with Bell and Harkness. And so I'm just, as I said in Tuesday's interview, I'm fascinated with historical fiction when you take real people and you put them into these fictionalized settings in more than just a cameo way, because often in historical fiction, you meet a historical figure, there's this kind of brief encounter, and you don't really encounter the character enough to be like, I wonder how accurate that was to history. But when you have a character who's got a pretty major role in a book, I am fascinated by how that works. So Bradley and I speak about that. I had so much fun speaking with Bradley. He is just a delight, and I say somewhere in the interview, I think that I could just do podcasts about his life, because he's led a very interesting life. And I don't know, I could just take him out for coffee or whatever he wants to drink and just ask him all of my questions that I didn't want to ask on the podcast because it would have been 800 hours long. At any rate, I do have copies of Queen's Gambit to give away. So if you are a fan of historical fiction and mysteries that are historical fiction, then you should definitely stay tuned to the end of the episode to find out how you can win a copy of Queen's Gambit by Bradley Harper. Let's go ahead now and get to the interview with Bradley.
I would start off that I am a complete nerd. I was a nerd before that word existed. I may have invented the genre. I don't know. And I grew up on the edge of Tulsa, Oklahoma. And in the summertime, my big thing was reading. But the bookmobile only came out once a week. So I'd ride my bicycle with a big wire basket in front, about 3 miles each way, and I could check out 4 books. So I would check out my 4 and read 1 book a day for 4 days, and then wait 3 days until the bookmobile came back. And one day I saw a book that was the complete collection of Sherlock Holmes stories. So I said, well, that should take me more than 1 day to read, and I checked that out, and it took me about 2 weeks, actually. I remember crying when the last story was read because there were no more. But I became a lifelong Sherlock Holmes fan. Wound up going into the Army. There was a place called Vietnam, and for some reason or other, my draft number was 84. So I was in the infantry, and one day I went on sick call, and the doctor that saw me was such an unpleasant individual. I went home to my wife and says, if that guy can make it through medical school, I think I can. And so I did. Went to the Uniformed Services University, became a pathologist in the Army, did 37 years active duty, about 200 autopsies, about 20 forensic death investigations, and then after I retired, I struck up a correspondence with a nonfiction author named Mary Roach. I loved a book that she wrote called Packing for Mars, and wrote her a fan letter, and she wrote me back and said, well, I mentioned I was a pathologist, and she said, what would you like, or do you have any ideas for my next book? And I mentioned that in the Department of Defense, we did a lot of human research, and so I got her in, through the door, introduced her to some people, and the book came out, resulted from that, called Grunt. I saw how she did that. I says, I think I could write a book. And how hard could it be? Well, it took me 5 years from when I sat down to start putting down my thoughts until I had a published book in my hand. So she made it look a lot easier than it is, but of course she's written several books. But I had an idea for a book based on my love of Sherlock Holmes, and I was going through a biography of Doyle, and I found out, to my surprise, the first Holmes story, A Study in Scarlet, was written in 1886, and Doyle almost couldn't give that thing away. He went to all sorts of publishers. They all turned him down. Finally, the wife of one of the publishers said, you should buy this. She pulled it out of the trash, basically, and looked at it. Says, you should buy this. So the publisher, to make his wife happy, offered Doyle £25, which was a total insult. Doyle was writing adventure stories for boys' magazines. He would get £25 for a short story, and Study in Scarlet is a novella. And they also insisted on full copyright. Well, at this time, Doyle was so disgusted, he just wanted to get rid of the thing, said fine, took the 25 pounds and said he would never write another crime story. 1890, he was persuaded to return to Sherlock Holmes, and history was made. The Jack the Ripper did all his ill doing between August and early November of 1888, and suddenly stopped without knowingly being caught. And so it came to me that I could write up a story involving Doyle and the hunt for Jack the Ripper to explain why Doyle returned to writing Sherlock Holmes, and why the Ripper suddenly stopped without knowingly being caught. And someone somewhere said, if you want to read a book and it hasn't been written, then you should write it. So I did that, and like I said, long story short, I wound up getting an agent and selling it. And then they wanted another book, and that just came out this past week, and so here I am. That was a long answer to your question. I hope it wasn't too much.
No, thank you. I appreciate that. That you have. There's so many questions. I could do a whole podcast just asking about your life, but we'll stick to your book.
See, I told you that I could do a whole podcast just on Bradley's life. Maybe that will be my next podcast. It will just be the GSMC Bradley Harper podcast, because I'd listen to it. But we are going to take our first break of the podcast, and when we come back, more on Queen's Gambit by Bradley Harper. So stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I'll be right back.
Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast. Together we dive into the world of sci-fi and science fiction. From episodes of Star Trek, Star Wars, to The Walking Dead, Resident Evil, all the hot new science fiction movies from the back doors of Marvel or DC. The Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast. You'll never look at science fiction the same way again.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast. I am speaking today with Bradley Harper about the second novel in his Margaret Harkness series. Let's go ahead and get back to that interview with Bradley.
So the first book that you mentioned is the story of Jack the Ripper and Sherlock Holmes. It's called A Knife in the Fog, and that's the first Margaret Harkness book, correct?
Yes.
So that introduces us to this character. Can you tell a little bit about Margaret as the main character of this series?
I certainly can. I was reading, of course, I was doing a lot of research about Jack the Ripper, and I came across a very interesting individual named Richard Jones. Mr. Jones started off as a mail carrier in Whitechapel, and saw these plaques, so Ripper victim was found here, or this clue was found here, or whatever. So he got full-time into history and has written 2 books on Jack the Ripper, and he and I began a correspondence. And ultimately, I went to London and bought out a tour that he does on Jack the Ripper. So that night, it was just him and myself for about 3.5 hours wandering Whitechapel at night. And the book of his that I bought, it mentions Margaret briefly. She was a suffragette and a writer, and she was living in Whitechapel at the time of the Ripper murders because she wanted to live the life like the characters she portrayed in her novels, who were all the London working poor. So it came to me that perhaps I could have her serve as Doyle's guide initially in the story to, not only to be able to introduce Whitechapel as a character, but also to kind of highlight the status of women in Victorian society at that time. Well, I got her on the page, and there's a third character I should mention, Professor Joseph Bell. He's also a major character in the story, and he was Doyle's inspiration for Sherlock Holmes. Bell was very famous for his ability to diagnose patients when they walked through the door, and in real life he did assist in some forensic cases as a medical examiner. That wasn't his title, but that's something that he took on as a sideline. And so the three of them together, they call themselves the Three Musketeers. And I didn't mean to do this, but at the end, when I finished my story, I realized that I had ascribed to each of the three characters one of the three aspects of human personality. Conan Doyle is pure ego. He's a guy who follows the rules. The peas can't touch the carrots. He's a very conventional British gentleman. Bell is super ego. He understands the need for rules, but also he knows there's times to go beyond the rules or to bend them so that a higher purpose can be achieved. And then finally, there's Margaret, who is pure ed. She says what she thinks as soon as she thinks it, and she's a person we tend to admire, but we have difficulty becoming ourselves until we've had at least 2 stiff drinks. So the interplay of those three characters really made for some great dialogue and raised the standard of the story so much she became, like I said, a full-fledged character in the novel. And so this second story, Queen's Gambit, she's the major protagonist. Bell is with her early on, and he fades away, and Doyle makes a cameo. But this is primarily her story and that of the assassin who's trying to kill Queen Victoria, and an inspector from the special branch of Scotland Yard who's working with Margaret to try to stop him.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, so it's fascinating. Talk a little bit about how it is writing historical fiction, where you often encounter real people in history, but talk about how it was writing someone who's pretty well known, at least people think they know Conan Doyle. How was it to kind of fictionalize that real person?
Well, you say he's well known. He's well known at a very superficial level. He was a very complicated. Yeah. Sherlock Holmes is the epitome of the cold, calculating, non-feeling human computer. He's sort of like Spock with a deer stalker cap. But in point of fact, Doyle himself is a very passionate man. He got into spiritualism later in life, which, of course, to my mind, is the antithesis of the scientific method. And he was very active in politics. He was not a big fan of suffragettes early on in life, and he kind of modified his opinions later. Although his family was Irish, early in life, he thought that Ireland was an inextricable part of the British Empire. But in later life, he softened those views and supported Irish home rule. So he was a man who was complicated. He traveled extensively. At one point, he almost became an eye surgeon. He was about to give up his writing altogether when he was offered the chance to return to Sherlock Holmes. So he's a person that we think we know, but there's a lot to him that we don't. In fact, the night he agreed to write Sherlock Holmes was a very interesting event. Again, fact is oftentimes much more interesting than fiction, stuff that you can't make up. But he was invited to dinner at a posh hotel in London by an American magazine editor named Stoddard, and he also invited Oscar Wilde. At the end of the dinner, he offered each man a check for £100, which was a lot of money, if each of them would write something for his magazine. So Doyle returned to Holmes, and Oscar Wilde wrote The Picture of Dorian Gray. And I think that that was a darn good investment for that magazine publisher, is all I can say.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Wow. So let's talk a little bit more about the new book. You've mentioned a little bit about it with the plot to kill Queen Victoria. Can you speak a bit more about Margaret as the protagonist and what you think about her might resonate with your readers?
Okay. Margaret was a woman who was fiercely independent, and she tries to live her life on her own terms, which is difficult to do in the society at that time. I often have her dress as a man because it allows her to go places and do things that she could not do conventionally as a woman. And let's see. At one point, she was engaged to a politician. She broke that off after he discouraged her from writing, saying that she would not be able to do that after they were married because it might hurt him politically. Also, she'd be so busy supporting him. Yeah, so that ended that marriage. Her father tried to, who was a minister, by the way, tried to force her into a marriage with a suitable young man that her father had selected, and she rejected that. She was a professional woman. She was a nurse at first. She became a dispenser, meaning basically she was a pharmacist. She was allowed to dispense medications on the ward, which showed that she was a very intelligent person. And then she became a writer. But she had difficulty publishing under her own name of Margaret Harkness. And so she often used the name John Law, both as a journalist and as an author. She found that her books sold a lot better under a male name than a female name, and she wasn't the first woman to find that out. So she was constantly striving to make her way as a woman in a man's world. At one point, when she's dressed as a man, she says to Doyle that, despite my dress, or clothing, I should say, I don't want to be a man. The only thing I envy you is the abundance of pockets that you're fashioned.
I think modern women can still understand that.
Yeah. So she was a woman who really tried to make her own way in life. She never married. In later life, she said that her works would have to be her children. So you could say she was a professional woman who had to make the same choices that women have to make today.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. What kind of research did you do for this book?
For the first one or the second one or both?
Let's either one. If you have, let's talk about the second one since that's the one that just came out.
Okay, very good. Well, there was a book which inspired me for the second book, and that's a book called The Day of the Jackal, written by Frederick Forsyth. It's a thriller that came out in 1973, and the host and the entire book goes back and forth between a pretty much heartless professional assassin and the police inspector who's been tasked with trying to stop an assassination attempt on Charles de Gaulle. So I thought this would be a good model for my book, but in my particular situation, my assassin is a basically decent man who's being manipulated by others to do something, So I want my reader to be sympathetic to his situation, although obviously he's trying to kill Queen Victoria. So you don't want him to succeed, but you don't want him to suffer either. And so I did a lot of reading about the anarchist, and was surprised to find out that Interpol was first created as a means for police forces throughout Europe to cooperate on hunting and controlling and spying on the anarchist movement. I learned a lot about the rifle that my assassin has. It's an air rifle, which it's similar to the one that Lewis and Clark carried on their expedition, which I didn't know about until I saw in the Pentagon when I used to work there. What else? I went to St. Paul's Cathedral because I decided I would use a rifle as a means to try to kill the Queen. And Queen Victoria was 78 years old during her Diamond Jubilee. She hated St. Paul's where the ceremony was to be held, and she had bad rheumatism, so she didn't want to be seen hobbling up the stairs in front of thousands of her loyal subjects. So she agreed to have the ceremony there, but she said, I'll sit in my carriage. You can bring the ceremony outside to me. So all the dignitaries, the Archbishop of Canterbury, the boys' choir, everybody else was on the step parade before her, and the ceremony was conducted in that manner. So for 20 minutes, she was sitting there in an open carriage, and I said, this is the ideal place for the assassin to try to take the Queen's life. So I went to the cathedral and stood exactly where the carriage was, and I looked around and I said, okay, if I was a sniper, where would I be? And I found that all the buildings around, there's a huge courtyard, as you can imagine, or I should say plaza, outside the steps. And all the buildings that were in this arc had temporary bleachers erected on top so people could sit up there and watch. So I said it'd be very difficult for a sniper to be able to fire under those bleachers without being caught. I looked straight where the queen would have been looking, right where her horses would have been pointed, and there's a side street, and I saw this building on the corner, and on the third story there was a window right there in the corner looking straight down to where I was standing. And I said, if I was a sniper, that's where I would want to be. So I walked down to that building. It turns out it's now an international youth hostel, but at the time of Queen Victoria's Diamond Jubilee, it was the boarding school for the boys' choir at St. Paul's. So during the ceremony, the building would have been practically empty. And so I said, that's where I want my assassin to be. So I knocked it, rang the doorbell. Nice young man came up, said, I explained who I was, why I was there, and I was given the run of the place with my wife. We went up to that room, and my wife had to climb up on top of the top bunk of the bunk bed, but because the window's about 6 feet or so off the floor, and up there looking out the window, it was just perfect. Would have been able to fire right down on her. I paced the distance from where her carriage sat to to the wall beneath that window was 88 paces, well within the range of the rifle I give to my assassin. And so after that, the story pretty much wrote itself.
Fascinating. I love the length you went, and I give kudos to your wife too for climbing up and laying there. Where you that's a good sport on your wife's part.
Okay, now obviously I don't know Bradley's wife. I've not actually met Bradley. We're just speaking via phone for the interview. And so I don't know his wife. I've never met either of them. And yet, don't they just sound like somebody you'd want? Don't they just sound like a couple you'd want to hang out with? I'm just picturing them. They're in England. They're in this. They're researching, and Mrs. Harper is totally game. Yeah, I'll climb up there. I'll lay down. I'll see if this works. I just I like that story, and I like them as this researching couple. But we are going to take our second break of the podcast. I will stop gushing over Bradley and his wife and their researching techniques. So stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I will be right back.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast. I am speaking with Bradley Harper about Queen's Gambit, the second in his Margaret Harkness mystery series. Let's go ahead and get back to the conclusion of that interview.
Are there autobiographical elements in the series?
Oh, that's a very good question. There are some things I've taken from my life. One of the other characters in my story is the 15-year-old daughter of the police inspector. She wants to grow up and be a female detective, and there were no such things at the time. In fact, at that time, the Metropolitan Police Department didn't even have any female police officers. The only ones on their payroll were the matrons who worked in the jails who took care of female prisoners. So I have Elizabeth is her name, and she's trained or mentored by Margaret on how to dress like a boy so she can do surveillance and move around society less noticed than she would as a girl. At one point, Margaret and James Ethington, the inspector, are talking to Elizabeth, and Elizabeth kind of has a meltdown, and she says, you say I can't do this, you say I can't do that. Well, how old do I have to be before I can do what I want to do? And I had the exact same discussion with my daughter when she was about 12. And so I have Margaret give Elizabeth the same answer I gave to my daughter. And I said, well, I don't know yet. I said, I don't know, dear. Apparently, I'm not that old. I'm not old enough. Because I was still in the Army. I sure couldn't do what I wanted to do, right? So,
right.
Yeah, so it's autobiographical in that sense. And then I have one joke in there that was told to me by a German friend. And in fact, I use that German friend's name in the story. So bits and pieces of my life are in there. And of course, my medical expertise. Professor Bell makes some observations, which I, as a physician, I come from my medical background. So I use it in that regards. But I don't think it's anything of my personality. I don't think my personal life, which I would say, well, okay, I take that back. In the military, when I was infantry, I did a lot of marksmanship training. So I talk about how my assassin prepares his weapon to be fitted for a scope. So I guess in that regard, yes, there's some of me in there. I'm not real, So okay, I probably went far enough on that question.
No, I appreciate it. This is the second book in the series. Do you envision writing more? And if so, how many books do you think might be in the series?
Either 4 or 5. Margaret is a fascinating person, again, because she was a real person. I try to have my books be as close to her life story as possible. Right now I'm plotting a book based upon the theft of the Irish crown jewels from Dublin Castle in 1907. Again, truth is stranger than fiction. The man who was charged with the safekeeping of those jewels was a distant cousin of Conan Doyle. And Doyle offered to help in the search or to try to recover those jewels. In real life, his cousin turned him down, but I think, well, what if he had said yes? And so I see the early reviews of book 2 is people have enjoyed it well enough, but what they really liked about the first book was the interplay between Doyle and Margaret and Professor Bell. And so I see in the third book I can bring the three of them back together again, because by 1907, at the end of book 2, I have Margaret go to Australia, which she did for several years. But by 1907, she was back in England nursing her mother in her final months of her life. So that's true to reality. And Belle was still hale and hearty at that time. And so getting the three of them back together to try to recover the Irish crown jewels, I think will be a good story. The real facts of the case are fascinating. They were never recovered. And one of the principal suspects is Francis Shackleton, the younger brother of Ernest Shackleton, the Antarctic explorer. So, again, all these real personalities that were involved make for a very good story, and makes it a lot easier for me as a writer if I have true facts which are interesting in and of themselves. It's sort of like if you want to make a good stew, the better your ingredients, the better the stew. So I'll have some great ingredients to work with.
Oh, interesting. And how well known is Margaret Harkness? I mean, you seem to have at least some basic facts on her life. So was she easy to research?
No, she was not. Although she wrote quite a bit, she had a very private life. I was fortunate enough to take a cruise in the Pacific, and I had an extra day in Sydney. And what does a nerd like me do? I went to the New South Wales State Library, and I spent 2 hours with research librarians who very generously gave of their time. And I did some research on Margaret for her life in Australia, which was not previously known. There's one British professor in England who's written extensively about Margaret, and there's a website called the Victorian Web, which also has some articles about her, but still there's a lot about her life that is not known. There's only one image of Margaret that's known to exist. There's no photographs at all, but there's one pencil drawing, and I use that. in the afterword of my book. But in Sydney, I found out three interesting things about her. First of all, when she was in Western Australia, she had a typing service for a while. She reported suspicious lights in a house that was supposed to be deserted, and the constable found the owner of the house trying to burn it down for insurance fraud. And a horse that was named Margaret Harkness won a major race in Sydney in 1902.
Oh, so fascinating.
So either she owned the horse or someone named it in her honor, but it was like the major race for 2-year-olds for that year. And horse racing, I found out, was very popular in Australia at the time and still is. And so that was a very big deal. So those three facts I know for sure. I also know that the town that she was living in, I found out that there was a gold mining was the big thing where she was at, and a gold mine just outside of town flooded. 59 miners went down. 50 miners went down. 49 miners came back up, and there's one Italian miner that was thought lost. After a day or so, people heard tapping, and so the train from Perth to Coolgardie, which was the town, that set a new record for rushing a hard hat diving set to this mining town in Western Australia. And a miner and a diver went down, found the man in an air pocket, and so for the next 9 days brought him food and potable water and candles and letters from people wishing him well, until the water got far enough down that they could safely get him out. And the American mining engineer who supervised the rescue effort was someone you may have heard of. His name was Herbert Hoover.
Oh, wow. Wow. Yeah, so you just have, you're like a wealth of really sort of interesting, sort of random facts. It's amazing.
I'm very good at trivia. What can I say?
I love it. I love it. And I like that you can put all of those tidbits and the little bits of information into the book to make it, more true to life. So I appreciate that. So you are working on the third book now, is that correct?
I am. I haven't put any words down right now. I'm doing figuring out what characters I want to include and doing little bios on them. Again, I'm trying to use real people as much as possible. And one of the things I'm going to bring out in the book is the Irish crown jewels were used for an order called the Knights of St. Patrick. These were all Irish lords who had done something to demonstrate their loyalty to the British Empire, and a lot of the Irish saw them basically as traitors to the Irish. So, to the common Irishman, being a Knight of St. Patrick was basically saying you preferred England over your own people. And the political movement Sinn Féin was only started 2 years before 1905, before the theft of the Irish crown jewels. And so I won't go into too much detail, but they're going to be involved in this story to some extent to show why the jewels have never been recovered. I would also say that one of the suspects, or one of the people involved in this, was the Duke of Argyll. And the Duke of Argyll was the brother-in-law to King Edward VII. And there were some drunken revelries in the tower where the jewels were found, and he was implicated in those. So some people say that the reason that the jewels were never recovered was, there was an inspector from Scotland Yard that King Edward ordered to go to Ireland to supervise the investigation. He provided 2 reports. One he gave to the Royal Irish Constabulary. One he gave to King Edward. After King Edward read the report, he canceled the request from the Knights for a royal commission to look into it, and both copies of the inspector's reports have been removed from the archives, and no trace of them is known to exist today.
Interesting. Huh. Well, it sounds like it's going to be a lot of fun to write and then a lot of fun to read as well. You mentioned earlier about thinking, hey, I could do that. I could write a book. Had you ever thought about it before that point, or did it just kind of occur to you later in life, and you thought, I'm going to write this book?
Well, I used to write a lot of poetry. In high school, I was very shy with girls, but I'd write love poems. I would sell them to the football players for 25 cents each for them to give to the girls. That was my first paid gig as a writer. In fact, I was so shy with girls, I read a book on palmistry. So when I go to a party, I'd say I can read palms. All the girls would line up so I could read their fortunes. And I got to hold their hands anyway. So, you have to start somewhere. And but no, I wrote one short story when I was in the Army, maybe 25 years ago, science fiction. I used to read a lot of science fiction, and got turned down. I said, okay, that was fun, and I just kind of stopped there. So I didn't think much more about writing until after I retired from the Army, and I was 62 years old, and I said, I traveled a lot for the first 15 months and enjoyed that, but I said, I don't want to spend the rest of my life on a buffet line on a cruise ship, although I might look like I do. And so I decided to start writing. I figured the worst that would happen is my grammar would get better, and it did. So one thing led to another. My agent, by the way, is the 80th agent that I queried. So 79 said no. She said maybe. And we went back and forth a couple of times. I made some revisions she suggested. And when it went out to bid, 5 publishers bid on it. 3 audiobook companies bid on the rights for the audiobook. The audiobook won AudioFile Magazine's Earphone Award for 2019 in the category of mystery and suspense. And 3 weeks ago, I won the Silver Falchion Award for mystery, best mystery for 2019 at the Keller Nashville Crime Writers Convention in Nashville, Tennessee. And so for a guy who came to it late, I'm having a lot of fun, some success. I say I write for fun and profit, big F, small p. And there's a Japanese publisher bought the rights to Knife as well, and I'm going to get 10 free copies of Knife in the Fog in Japanese.
That's really cool.
Yeah, I have no idea what I'm going to do with them. But,
besides, look at it and be like, hey, I can't read this, but it's cool.
Yeah. If they make it into a manga, my 2 daughters might think finally that their old man's kind of cool.
Well, good luck with that part. When you take the time to read now, and I love the Bookmobile story. The Bookmobile was a big part of my childhood as well. Do you have favorite authors or genres that you like to read?
Well, I read in my genre, of course, but I also like to read outside. I just recently read a book that just blew me away, Bel Canto. I can't remember the author's first name, but her last name is Patchett. And I used to think that really to get inside a character's head, you had to write first-person point of view. There must be 45 different characters in that book, and you get to know and care about every single one of them. I mean, she's just a complete master. It's about a political kidnapping that goes wrong, and all the people that get involved in it. It's set in South America, which I was very interested in because when I was with the U.S. Army South as a command surgeon, I spent some time down in Colombia overseeing a training course we were doing for Colombian soldiers. And at that time, myself and members of my team, we all had a $1.5 million bounty on our head placed by the FARC for our delivery alive to them to be used as a hostage. Fortunately, I wasn't good and not worth anything dead. They had to deliver me alive. And whenever I tell people that, I say I want to make sure you understand that offer is no longer valid.
Just making it clear. Good to know.
I'm sorry. And other authors. Yeah, there's an author named Joe Ide, IDE, and he writes about a modern version of Sherlock Holmes named IQ. I've read the first and third book in his series, and the third book had one of the most powerful beginnings to a book I have ever read in my life. It just wow, just blew me away. And Lindsay Fay, she writes Sherlock Holmes pastiche short stories, very much in the voice of Conan Doyle. And there's a book called The Whole Art of Detection, which I just love. And although each story stands alone, over the course of the stories, that you begin to appreciate the relationship between Holmes and Watson. And yes, Watson very much needs Holmes, but over time you get to understand that Holmes needed Watson as well.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, thank you for that.
And Alexander McCall Smith, the ladies' #1 detection agency, is just a hoot.
Oh yeah. Thank you. Do you have a website, and can people find you on social media?
Yes, ma'am, they certainly can. My website is www.b as in boy, Harper, Harper, author. That's not Arthur, but author, author.com. And then can find me on Instagram and Twitter as B Harper Author. And
all right.
I try to keep it simple because I'm a simple guy.
I don't think that's true, but we'll let you have that. We've talked about a lot of different topics. I've enjoyed hearing your stories. Is there anything though that we haven't covered that you would like to talk about in terms of this series or the Queen's Gambit specifically that we just haven't talked about?
Gee whiz, the time has flown by. I can't believe it. I think I probably told you as much as you or your listeners would want to hear about me, at least today.
Okay. Well, I appreciate it so much. Thank you so much for joining me for talking about this series. I really loved learning a little bit more about Margaret as a real person, so thank you so much.
Well, Sarah, thank you very much. It's been a real delight talking with you today, and all I can say is thank you. This has been fun.
It really was fun. I enjoy all of the interviews that I do with authors, and I very much enjoyed this one as well. So thank you once again to Bradley Harper for joining me to talk about not only this book, Queen's Gambit, but also the first book in the Margaret Harkness mystery series. That one is called A Knife in the Fog and deals with the story of Jack the Ripper and investigating Jack the Ripper. So I haven't had a chance to read that one, but I'm thinking there's definitely some suspense, some mystery, some thriller elements in there as you are tracking a serial killer through the fog. And Margaret is a woman, and Jack the Ripper targeted women, although a specific type of woman, maybe not Margaret's type exactly, but doesn't matter. Still, I don't want to be walking through the London fog knowing that there is a homicidal maniac serial killer with a knife tracking me. No, I'm good. I'll just stay here in the studio and talk to people. So thank you once again to Bradley. Thank you as always to my listeners. If you are interested in winning a copy of Queen's Gambit by Bradley Harper, all you have to do is go to GSMC Book Review, Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram and comment on this episode. It is episode 184, Interview with Bradley Harper. We make it very easy to figure out which one you're looking for. GSMC Book Review, Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram, and comment on the episode. You can like it, you can share it, you can follow the pages. Please do so. That helps us out so much. But in order to be entered to win a copy of Queen's Gambit, you do have to comment. And I think this time, let's see, we commented on favorite historical fiction, the era that you like best for historical fiction. And we got some great answers. Thank you to everyone who commented on the last episode. So this time, to keep with the theme of historical fiction, let's go ahead, comment and tell me your favorite historical fiction encounter in a book. You know, what actual historical figure did you enjoy the most when they were encountered in a historical fiction novel. That's all you have to do. Just make that comment on one of those social media pages and you will be entered to win a copy of this book. So thank you once again for joining me for the GSMC Book Review Podcast. Join me again on Tuesday when I will be speaking with Bonnie Hurst about her memoir. It's called Test of Faith, and it talks about, and the subtitle is Surviving My Daughter's Life Sentence. So it is a memoir of, you kind of gather her daughter has been sentenced to life in prison, and she talks about how that process was and how it affected their family and how they have moved through that. So join me on Tuesday for that interview with Bonnie S. Hurst. In the meantime, have a wonderful weekend and take some time to get lost in a good book. Thanks.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Book Review Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.